Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mongol warfare of China between the late 12th and the 14th century. We will be looking mostly of course at the Yuan dynasty, but also probably the Mongol conquest of China. As you know, we've made lots of videos about Mongol warfare, but we haven't quite talked about their Chinese power base. This video is, by the way, just the first of three, I think, that I will be, in fact, separating given the immensity of the topic, and this counts as, of course, a very, very short introduction of the usual ones, Schwerpunkt dares, architecting, and of course at some point we will get into greater depth. The other two episodes will, little spoiler, be about the tactics and organization, and probably the most important battles, at least, of Mongol warfare at this time and in this part of the world. Then we will talk about the arms and armor and the military dress that we have, as you know, already actually began to address in other videos. But with this Chinese bias, like you will look at some sort of more precise iconographic and archaeological evidence. This is not, by the way, part of the warfare of this region from the 11th to the 14th century. It will be another one about this, at least looking at China as a whole, not specifically the Mongol Chinese warfare. It doesn't matter how sort of important, also before the Mongol conquest of the country, this really was. So some things will be very, very simple, very sort of macroscopic, but we'll essentially list today all the major Mongol wars, at least based on the sub-regions of this enormous, as a matter of fact, subcontinental reality. Some we have already seen looking at the perspective of the conquered peoples. We talk about Vietnam, we talked about Burma, we talk about Korea. I still have to do so for Japan, for example, but also the same Qin and Song dynasties of China. On the other hand, we will look a bit at Mongolia itself, and so of course where the Mongols sprang from and what kind of military culture they had been developing, and also what kind of influences they received, right? And of course, from a Chinese perspective, there is definitely a lot going on in the relation with the steppes from millennia, right? What had happened, for example, with the Xiongnu, had really been mirrored by other say groups that had formed, like in this territory of essentially Turkic, Turco-Mongolian or Proto-Turkic, Proto-Mongolian at some point realities, depending on how you wanna frame them over the millennia. And we have seen, especially in the video about the Liao-Kitai warfare, how, of course, influenced by Mongol warfare, China already was by the time of Genghis Khan. And vice versa, right? How much, not much the Mongols probably of the ethnic interland, like the same Chingizids would spring from, but in fact, these other parts of the Mongol offspring that had been in part sedentarizing in the north of China, mostly across this enormous frontier, but also that was half-stepped to a degree. There is a sort of gradual, in fact, divide between the sedentary, urbanized, agricultural wardens of the steppe, tribal, cattle-based one that had, again, heavily intertwined since antiquity. For example, we talked this in the video about the Persian war horse of the Fergana Valley, the heavenly horse, as a matter of fact, that the Chinese had began to import at a certain point when struggling against the quite sort of cavalry developed steppe peoples and replicating this, say, horse breeding industry, we can't really say, across the entire country, or at least where the pastures allowed this, the same Augustus, right, conquering Egypt finally at the end of the civil wars, brings back from Egypt, as a matter of fact, one of these magnificent mounds, because this was transcontinentally like the highest sense of equestrian heroism, of cavalry culture from the steppes that everybody admired. Naturally, that was a bit early on, and the Turkic and Mongol waves were yet to appear. Some of them would actually seize these territories, including the Fergana Valley, etc. We're not going to digress much on this, if not as far as the Mongols are concerned. But these are truly, like, in the broader picture, like of steppes, waves, etc., that we mostly covered in depth, especially as far as arms and armor is concerned in the Eurasian Steppes Warfare series. It had been probably in the ultimate northeastern corner of the steppes, actually in a very underdeveloped context, right? One that, in a sense, makes you understand also the pressure, the hunger and anger that these peoples had sort of cultivated after also, in fact, millennia of witnessing different waves from more successful peoples or tribes, in fact, offsprings of the same groups. And definitely there is all a context for this also as far as the Mongol-Sino relations are concerned. By the end of the 12th century, there were three major tribes within the Mongol nation, each of which essentially despised one another. Plus, there were also surrounding peoples that we will observe now. If we were to make really a history of the territory of today's Mongolia, we would have to trace back over 40,000 years, like to the Upper Paleolithic, with the local political and military organization evolving through the Bronze and Iron Ages into this distinct tribal kingdoms amidst surely very complex and complicated at times historically. Just think about the documentation, interactions with surrounding cultures and states. At this point, of course, they were all illiterate, right? And in fact, China is the main source there of documentation. Now, early tribal organizations in Mongolia faced internal conflicts and competition, notably exemplified by groups like the Rouran Khaganate, which operated until the Gök Turks rose to establish the first Turkic Khaganate. Recently re-uploaded a video made a couple of years ago about the Gök Turk army's organization. However, this Turkic dominance was destined to fade as well, and especially in this region, as the Chinese Tang dynasty expanded its influence towards the west. It was a major concern for the Chinese Empire to secure exactly the corridors of the Silk Road towards the west, surpassing the great Central Asian deserts and controlling all, in fact, the caravan centers that were located in there. And this would culminate in the same downfall of the Uyghur Khaganate as the major sort of political event. As centuries passed, Mongolia witnessed the emergence of the Khitan, right, the Liao we were talking about before. Knowing, in fact, for having founded this Liao dynasty, which governed a vast expanse covering Mongolia as well as parts of eastern Siberia. This powerful dynasty ultimately influenced the dynamics of East Asian politics, as internal strife among the Mongol tribes was exacerbated by external pressures, including the manipulative strategies of the Yurkans that we will see in a while, who encouraged conflict among the Mongols to limit their potential threats. These were Sinicized dynasties that were, in fact, essentially trying to divide at this point the Mongols to have them weak, because eventually, that other polities instead tended to actually coalesce, like to cooperate with some leaders to stop, like the individual tribes to launch raids independently, and therefore complicating the situation. But here, evidently, there was like a growth importance of Mongol power and pressure, throughout all these domino effects, and so the Chinese were already signaling essentially indirectly to the Mongols that there was something to gain further from their crisis. Now, in the late 12th century, the charismatic leadership Genghis Khan successfully united the fractious Mongolian tribes into the formidable force that we know, ultimately leading to the establishment of what we know as the Mongol Empire. This empire would expand dramatically across Asia, as we know, decisively conquering the same China. Now we will see in the depths of that. So in a series of military campaigns that began with the neighboring attacks on neighboring dynasties like the same Khitan-led Western Liao and the Tangut-led Western Xia, eventually culminating in the Yuan dynasty that was founded by Kublai Khan later on. The neighbors of the Mongols, as we have just evidenced in the west, were the Tangut, and in the east, the Yurchen or Sin, right? And the latter had essentially, Tangut were a bit more savage. The eastern one had been heavily Sinicized, as we will see. Now, the Tangut people were a Sino-Tibetan ethnic group that founded and inhabited the Western Xia dynasty in what is only now northwestern China. Initially, under Tuyun authority, they later submitted to the same Tang dynasty. Of course, like all these groups were heavily controlled by the Chinese anyway. And following the collapse of the Tang dynasty, the Tanguts established the Western Xia dynasty. They spoke their Tangut language, which was previously thought to be related to the Qiangic or He languages with the Tibeto-Burban family, but is now classified as part of the Gyalrongek branch. The Western Xia dynasty was destroyed by the Mongols in 1227, leading to the loss of most of its written records and architecture. By the way, that they had sound at this point, like we're talking the 13th century, the Chinese influence had gone far and beyond. So even if in primitive ways, there were, again, these frontiers were very complex and also with different levels of development within the same. And notice, by the way, that today the Tangut language and script are extinct, right, with only fragments of Tangut literature remaining, which is something you have to attribute to the very tender-hearted and very funnily cute exploit of those scoundrels of the Mongols. You know, the as far as the Yurchen are concerned, these are known as the Manchus. So a group of Tungusic-speaking people from northeastern China or Manchuria today, and before the 18th century, they lived as hunter-gatherers, semi-nomadic pastoralists, or settled farmers. So as you understand, this Mongol neighbors were pretty much like akin to them. Just for like a more northern note, in 1635, the Yurchens were officially renamed Manchus by the Hong Taiji, and lacking central authority and communication among different groups, many of them came under the influence of nearby dynasties, with their leaders often serving in nominal roles as hereditary border guards, because they would preserve that sort of violent lifestyle. And you know that the Chinese were to use them in the first place as peoples that we've seen being as west in space as the Alans, right? That we know at some point during the same Yuan dynasty of China, providing with bodyguards for the Mongol emperors, which is actually mind-blowing. Again, I explained this in the video about the Alans, but we'll hopefully keep talking about it, even though we know also just too few. So as we were saying before, we have the emergence of Genghis Khan. Temujin, we are in 1204 AD. Temujin was the son of Yasugai of the Yaka tribe. All right. Temujin's father's history is interesting. Like, just to give you like sort of the background of the situation. His name was Yasugai or Yasugai Bagathur, right, and also known as Yasuke. He was born in 1134. He died in 1171. He was a prominent chief of the Kamag Mongol Confederation. His name, and it would be very interesting to digress on Mongol onomastics, but I will also be butchering all the Chinese phonetics for that matter, but they had very powerful sort of transcendental meanings. Yesugei's name signifies auspicious qualities linked to the lucky number 9 in Mongolian culture. This has to do in part also with Mongolian army organization that in any case was decimal in bases, like basically all the steppes armies that we have ever seen. Yesugei belonged to the Borjigin family, and his father was Bartan Bagatur, a descendant of Kabul Khan, who was recognized as a Khagan by the same Jin dynasty as a proof, by the way, that also Temujin's background wasn't really sort of detached like a bunch of, I don't know, savages from nowhere that, of course, like, clinically speaking, that could have not been possible in the first place, but the contacts with China were running deep in Mongol culture by this point, and beyond. Like, the Christianity was a thing, for example, among the Mongolian tribes, together with other, in the historian way at least, together with other so-called monotheisms. Now, Yesugei's chief wife was He Lun, whom he abducted from her prior husband, driven by her beauty and fertility. After the death of the Khan of the Kamag Mongol Confederation, Yesugei ruled de facto, aided by his blood brother Togrul Khan, also known as Ban Khan, and he assisted Togrul in combat against his uncle. Following Yesugei's death, Togrul initially supported Temujin, but later sided with Temujin's rival Yamuka. Yesugei was poisoned by the Tatars while attempting to join a feast during a wedding, which occurred shortly after leaving Temujin with Berta's family to arrange their marriage. And despite feeling ill from the poisoning, he returned home and died, only to die 3 years later. Temujin rose, as we've seen it here, at the beginning of the 13th century out of these terrifyingly bloody power struggles. He was an outcast at some point, chased down by his enemies, eating carcasses out there in the wilderness. But he managed to smash a position and soon had the majority of the Mongol tribes under his banner. It was a sort of lightning sort of blitz rise. We're not going to talk today properly about the rise of Genghis Khan. This is for other videos. But just to give you an idea here of more or less the times, the figures, and the spaces, the peoples involved. In 1206, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, that is, Emperor of the Seas, Prince of Conquerors, World Conqueror. There are different translations for this title, but the idea of oceanic ruler, the fact that this storming, in fact, seas of the steppes would launch these massive tidal waves every once in a while, and Genghis Khan incarnating literally such greatest accomplishment is definitely the most sort of meaningful explanation of the title. As we've seen, as a youth, Temujin had quite an experience, and as we observed in other videos, this is very important as far as the later conquest of China is concerned. He had served as an auxiliary to the Khitan Liao, whose tactics and organization he studied. He had the chance of appreciating, especially in this more developed sort of Sinicized background was concerned. This will be important, especially for having this more, say, primitive Mongols of the hinterland mature polyurcetic capacity, as we will see now that, in fact, the initial campaigns of Genghis Khan against the Yurchen, for example, were not entirely successful because of the urban defenses, and that the steppes peoples had always had some problem with, but not for actually the other Mongols that had at this point, in fact, partly infiltrated and run parts of China, and that, in fact, sort of adopted the best of both cultures. The main problem with them was, however, that their tribal structure, like their oil fields, were truly in the steppes. In terms of manpower and again also political control, because that was based all on that deterrence. You had these hordes that stationed in the steppes that fundamentally never changed their lifestyle. And you could simply threaten the sort of softer, sort of more fragmented parts of China through these massive and brutal expeditions into the heart of the country. I already made a video about the Khitan also recently, so we appreciated their military. The Khitan people were essentially a nomadic group from Northeast Asia, apparently from the regions that are now parts, in fact, of Mongolia, Northeast China, and the Russian Far East, beginning their prominence in the 4th century. They descended from Proto-Mongols and the Xianbei, and they spoke the now extinct Khitan language, which is related, in fact, to the Mongol one. The Khitans established and led the Liao dynasty that ruled between 916 and 1125, controlling a significant territory across Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China, using, by the way, for this reason, straddling this to very different areas, 2 writing systems, the Khitan small script and the Khitan large one. And after the Liao dynasty fell to a Yurchen invasion in 1125, many Khitans migrated westward with Yalu Dashi to form the Kara Khitai, or Western Liao dynasty in Central Asia, which lasted until, in fact, the same Mongol conquest in 1218. They are a very interesting thing because they, even though they were now sort of not even a ramp state, but literally like a refugee state that moved literally through their semi-nomadism to Central Asia, they essentially managed to remain even out of their homes. They were trying to regain, together with all the Chinese, right, investiture of power they had once sort of essentially bestowed on themselves. They were the leading regional power in the era. So, in a sense, like foreshadowing what would have happened as far as the western push of the Saint Chingizid later on. The Khitan also established several other dynasties in China, smaller ones, including the northern Liao, the eastern Liao, and the later Liao, as well as the Kutluk Khanid dynasty in Persia. The modern Daur people in northeast China are descendants of the Khitans, and the term Khatai, historically used in Europe to refer to China, famously enough, in fact, is derived from the Khitan name, because this is, in a sense, what they had come to be known more closely, given these immense spaces from the Western perspective. In 1205, Genghis Khan defeated the Tangut that we have already seen, and in 1209 he moved on the Yurchen. The walled cities of the Yurchen chain proved too tough, however, for the still young Mongol army, and this is, in fact, quite a relevant point, as we were saying before. Nevertheless, in 1215, Yanqing, that is today Peking, then the capital of the Jin, fell and was put to the torch. This is the sort of the most important part of the story, the Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty, which spanned actually across like the 10s and the 30s of the 13th century. It was a protracted conflict between the rising Mongol Empire and the Yurchen-led Jin dynasty in Manchuria and northern China. The Jin were essentially the northern Chinese power, regional power. In the south you had the Song, we'll see them now. Now, the war between the Mongols and the Jin was initiated after the latter rulers who had historically oppressed the Mongol tribes into this sort of ambiguous relation, because in part they had themselves been influenced by the Mongols, demanded, in fact, the full submission of Mongolia, a demand that was met with open defiance from Genghis Khan, that now was, of course, evidently that threatening to China herself. The tensions escalated into warfare as Genghis Khan galvanized his forces, mobilizing the grievances of his people against the Yurkens. And the Mongols began their campaign with decisive victories, including the pivotal Battle of Yoling, where they overwhelmed the Jin troops. And despite initial setbacks suffered by the Mongols, their relentless advance led to the capture, as we were saying before, of Beijing, known as Zong, in 1215. The Jin Empire, realizing the severity of their situation, because this wasn't happening like overnight, right? There were different checks that were systematically subjugated by this relentless Mongol expedition, relocated their capital south towards Kaifeng. Yet resistance continued to falter as infighting and strategic blunders weakened their position. By the time Ögedei Khan took command after Genghis Khan's death, the Mongols were pressing hard against the Jin continuously in the ensuing years. Combined actions by the Mongols and their newfound allies from the southern Song dynasty of China further encircled the Jin. A series of battles characterized these years, ultimately leading to the Jin surrender and the suicide of the same emperor Aizong in 1234, marking the end of the Yurken-led Jin dynasty. So you have a bit of karma there because of this sort of ambiguity that the Mongol rulers had, in fact, had towards the same Chinese. Like, they weren't so culturally performing; they were just installing themselves as dynasties into China. This is essentially also what Genghis Khan's successors, but never like in the case of the Mongolian Empire. In fact, such an enormous military force had been able to overwhelm the entirety of China, as we'll see now. And so, even though, yes, sort of the same reality represented, because Mongolia stayed Mongolia and China stayed China, of course, there's a massive influence and a true Mongolian accomplishment over, as we'll see now, this impressive series of territories that is shocking to believe how sort of effectively they were conquered and controlled. And in fact, if we look at the war against the Jin, not only this showcased the Mongol military acumen, but also significantly altered the regional power dynamics. This was like a major conflict, like half of China had been basically subdued, and to a degree of control that, as you know, today we don't talk about the Western expeditions of the Mongols, but those are the ones that are happening in parallel. So this gives you a scale of Mongol military power and sort of strategic vision, all in all. It brought, in fact, to a mass defection of Han Chinese, properly sort of ethnic Chinese, and the same Khitan soldiers to the Mongols. And the reason being that the latter promised more favorable treatment. Their point was to sort of float, like oceanically, over this enormous land, and China being literally everything under heaven. And so they were very much, of course, favoring this side of the world, as, of course, just for practical purpose, they were just very close to it. They had the manpower and the veterans to control it. And in the West, things went successfully, but also not as much as China would obviously become. And so the fall of the Jin was met with this properly structured transition to Mongol rule. It wasn't just like yet another people installing themselves on a bit of China, or in this level of sort of promiscuous political ambiguity, as far as also other Mongols were involved. The Mongol here, Genghis Khan had united the same Mongols as well, so there's a much more direct compactness, cohesion. Without mentioning, of course, this is happening in the wake of the great, the peak of the great medieval civilization. There is a demographic expansion, an economical one, and so this is all fuel for for Mongol rule, right? That where policies favored the survival, of course, of local Chinese administration and skilled individuals, enriching the Mongol state with profoundly impacting the social, political, but also the military landscape of northern China. You know, that essentially this is the moment in which the Mongols acquired the greatest, the full polyurcetic capacity. We know that there were probably Chinese military engineers that were carried as far as Europe, and that were a bit like the architects of the main, in fact, polyurcetic feats of the Mongols that really managed to raise to the ground cities like Baghdad, Merv, to subdue the Rus, to devastate far and wide. Now, again, it's almost disappointing for myself to be so superficial, but aside from the fact that we have a lot more to say, we will come back on these topics, right? This is just like a mega introduction to the main campaigns, the main conquests of the Mongolian Empire, right? We have seen also in the video dedicated to medieval Korean warfare how the Mongols continued under Genghis Khan to command to take, in fact, Korea, while in the West the Mongols were penetrating to Crimea, Persia, and continue fighting in and about China, as we will see now, because that's in fact where most of their military effort was concentrated. And this should never be forgotten, as far as also that video I made on the let's say the reasons why the Mongols would have never really conquered Europe. They would have never committed themselves even to do such a thing. And of course, their ambitions were that transcontinentally enormous. But of course, there were also quite concrete problems as far as their power basis for a prolonged campaigning in Europe, from the limited, in fact, resources that the Eastern European steppes could provide. There was nothing closer there to Germany or Italy, right? And these are lands that Mongol, say, raiders did reach, right? They entered Germany, they crossed the Alps, but campaigning in places like Germany or Italy, where you have to step every 10 kilometers to a castle or a city, well, it's really another story. And that's also not the only way why the Mongols objectively could have not projected successfully, at least, a power into the heart of Europe and getting out there successfully. And the European spirit was defiant, right? Some of the most priceless episodes are the responses of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, and also like the ones we can sort of imagine of the same Pope, and we also know how it really went. I made recently some videos also as far as the Europeans, as you know, engage into an alliance with the Mongols when they had unitly stopped being dangerous. And it was actually the Mongols that were also requiring part, at least for the ones of the Ilkhanate, etc., some Western support against peoples like the Mamluks, for example. And as we were saying before, by the way, there would be Alanian men-at-arms in the same imperial bodyguards of Mongol China. But recapitulating from our previous video, also the Mongol conquest of Goryeo, that is Korea, between 1231 and 1270, the Mongol Empire launches a series of devastating military campaigns against the Goryeo dynasty of the Korean peninsula, marked by the significant, that there had already been, as you've seen, interferences in the previous generations. That doesn't begin out of the blue, but this is an incredibly violent and traumatic page, like in East Asian history, marked by significant loss of civilian life, and leading, in fact, to Goryeo's status as a vassal of the state of the Yuan dynasty for around 80 years, 3 generations or so, until the mid-14th century crisis. Although Goryeo officially submitted to Mongol rule, resistance lived on, including notable rebellions like the Sambyeo-One, and some areas remained actually beyond Mongol control as late as 1274. Right, there were some Korean fortifications really put up an astounding resistance, right? A really fierce one. Like the Mongols may have been sort of, again, terrifying to say the least, but the Koreans were also not particularly, velvet-gloved people. They used human fat for the explosives in their counter siege artillery from the city walls. And so there are these episodes of heroic resistance to China. And Mongol China, even more. So it's the most terrifying thing of all, you could argue. Now the Mongols first clashed with Goryeo in 1211, as we were saying before, under Chingizid-Khan. And this had occurred during conflicts with the Khitan, which predated the major invasions that we were talking about from the 30s of the same century. Subsequent confrontations led to early relations characterized by hostility and mistrust. It's not really that the Chinese and the Koreans have a great history of mutual understanding. This culminated in Goryeo's capitulation in 1232 and subsequent relocations of the Korean royal court to more defensible positions like the Gangwa Island, right, which tells it all, right? We're trying to save their skins. As Mongol forces repeatedly invaded the peninsula, Goryeo managed to resist for lengthy periods, demonstrating a level of resilience, again, unseen in other regions, overwhelmed swiftly by the Mongol conquests. These Koreans really had massive attributes, and various shifts in power and internal strife with both the Goryeo court and Mongol command influenced the persistent conflicts with, while the Mongols extracted tributes that strained Goryeo's resources as well. Over time, of course, very complicated ties developed, including marriages between the two ruling families, which symbolized both subjugation and a form of coexistence. They were sort of co-opting the elites just to have better control. It's really normal, especially as far as like the 13th century progressed, and also everything was sort of getting exhausted. Like, imagine these countries being invested by a Mongol invasion. It's like we know what happened in the Kievan Rus, right, or in Poland, or I have a pretty graphic idea of the radical impact that these things would have on the substratum of the infrastructures, of the resilience capacity of the people. It was really a shocking, traumatizing event, changing their history forever at the deepest roots imaginable. Of course, despite these years of warfare and also cultural devastation, the Goryeo dynasty maintained some autonomy until it began to reclaim its independence. As we were saying before, accomplished the great collapse of the Mongol Osin, right? With the end of the Pax Mongolica, we are after the Black Death in the 50s of the 14th century. And this, of course, was in parallel amid the broader decline of the Yuan dynasty of China. Ultimately, the turbulent interactions with the Mongol Empire would have this lasting effects on Goryeo's political landscape, cultural exchange, and eventual resurgence in the region, which, again, against the Mongols is a major feat to pull off, to say the least. In 1227, the Genghis Khan, let's properly address it in the nomenclature, returned to finally subdue the Tanguts we have described. And we mentioned this because this is the campaign in which Genghis Khan died, a life spent killing I don't know how many tens of millions of people, but also creating definitely something that I think is more important than that in historical perspective, which is an incredibly brutal thing to say, I know, but in this particular time in history, it's not like the victims were particularly gentle-hearted, passive lambs to slaughter for no reason. That they were, the rules of the game were pretty neatly outlined. They all, as we've seen, recompensated each other at mutual benefit, let's say. So here, a bit of dynastic history. Ogodai, Chinggis Khan's third son, continued as successor and reopened hostilities in 1231 against the remnants, the relics of the Jin. As we've seen, this had enshrined themselves in the southern city of Kaifeng in 1233. Ogodai carried out this massive pincer movement together with the Song dynasty in the south, with, by the way, showing like how these were Worth children of Worth father, by the scope, the political and strategical vision, the capacity to solicit the southern Chinese that, as we will see, will actually end up, as we're spoiling before for those who do not know the story, under the Mongols, of course. Ogodai headed down the Yellow River. We made a video about Mongol logistics explaining literally what the literal hundreds of thousands of cattle that moved with the army, being partly the army as well, required like this very forced movements along this massive riverways just to sustain them logistically. And there were all kind of difficulties, of course. And again, I'm really, really sorry that I'm making this summary about the whole story. But these are beautiful, of course, campaigns to study in detail. Hopefully, we will do it one day. Ogodai was together with his brother Tuli, that was the fourth son of Chinggis Khan, while penetrating the province of Sichuan and encircling much of the Jin territory. And Subotai, perhaps the best Mongol commander, would finally take Kaifeng in 1233, in spite of the Ying explosive bombardment from the city in defense. And again, the campaign can be summarized, if you want, in this major showdown at the siege of Kaifeng. This occurred from April the 8th, 1232 to May the 29th, 1233. This for a medieval army is a huge deal. It is true that Kaifeng is not really in the middle of nowhere. There were resources to besiege it, but like the enormity of the forces and kept at siege for 1 year really shows you like the stubbornness and the tenacity, and ultimately the violently raw mentality of Mongol commanders. It was really a critical event, marking the fall of the Yurchen-led Jin dynasty and its capital. So territorially it's over. The siege resulted in this splendid Mongol victory, leading, by the way, to the flight of the Jin Emperor Aizong to Kaizu. So yes, there was some, of course, survival, right, but not as a polity. So the siege was initiated by Ogodai Khan, who had sent two armies, one led by himself and the other by his brother Tolui, to besiege Kaifeng, which had replaced, as we've seen, Zhongdu as the Jin capital due to the previous conflicts. Command of the forces merged under the leadership, however, of Subotai. The city's defenders faced severe resource shortages, famine, and disease, as you expect from this massive armies. These things happen because of the size of the armies, not because of the surrounding. Otherwise, there would have not really been a city there to besiege in the first place. And despite fierce resistance using advanced weaponry like fire lances and explosives, the Jin forces ultimately succumbed. The assassination of a Mongolian diplomat, by the way, further derailed peace negotiations, leading to despair and disunity among the Jin defenders. As the siege progressed, the Jin emperor fled. We're in early 1233, which is not a good sign, of course, for those remaining defending. Leaving General Kui Lin, in fact, in command. He soon agreed to surrender after executing loyalists, by the way, which was also very eloquent. The Mongols entered Kaifeng on May the 29th, proceeding to loot the city, capture imperial concubines, and execute royal family members. Right, you massacre the man, you rape the women. This is essentially what these people's logic exclusively were. Like, there is not really a diversion of any kind after millennial steps, a lifestyle. Now, and the Chinese were not particularly tender-hearted people, as we all know. Now, the siege of Kaifeng had this lasting historical consequences. Although it crippled the Jin dynasty, as we've seen, it did not entirely destroy it. Following a failed appeal for aid from the Southern Song dynasty, which instead allied with the Mongols, Jin forces were ultimately defeated at Kaizu, leading to the dynasty's final fall, in fact, the year after. The siege is historically significant for its use of military technologies, such as also this gunpowder weapons. You know that China had this apparently before Europe, but with kind of chemical combination that favored through the prevalence of sulfur rather than saltpeter, to a more incendiary effect rather than probably an explosive one. I will discuss this in other dedicated videos, but there had been contacts with, say, the western part of Eurasia, like the Chinese had been importing, for example, Arab military engineers in the previous centuries. And so there is this sort of sharing of knowledge, of skills, of know-how. This event also illustrates the shift of power in China from the Jurchen Jin to the Mongols, or at least the final accomplishment of the same. It set the stage for the subsequent, as we'll see now, Mongol conquest of the Song dynasty. And unlike their treatment of the Jin royalty, the Mongols would adapt a more lenient approach towards the Han Chinese population of the Southern Song, allowing some continuity of governance after their conquest, the reason being different, in part the fact that these were going to be more autonomous communities, and the Jurchen Jin had been sort of like this alter ego of the same Mongols, and there was something really more deeply personal about them, and that they needed to eradicate them to an important degree. Now, how did the Song war with the Mongols came about? So, as we've seen, by 1234, all Jin and Song provinces north of the Yellow River belonged to the Mongol Empire, right? This was because essentially the Southern Song dynasty remained in the south, and the Mongols immediately passed on to attack them and to seize even north of the Yellow River what was just available. Like, it was just, they would have controlled it anyway, and of course the plan was to move on against the Song. Now, the Song do something weird, that instead of accepting this grant of hiatus, also perhaps in this delusion of imperial grandeur, because they seemed like the last Chinese, right? The hands standing the ground against the barbarians, whereas the Jin, yes, had ruled mostly over Chinese people, but they were barbarians themselves, now assaulted Mongol cities and towns in an effort to re-establish, especially their lands north of the Yellow River. And so this war follows, right, a massive retaliatory campaign from the Mongol side that puts an end to Chinese rule even in the south of the country until 1368. This is, by the way, making the Mongols control, to say the least, a shockingly vast, but I mean, it's just vast amount of demographic and agricultural power, right? Massive manpower, massive labor force that, as we will see, probably the Mongol army will use also to subdue the surrounding countries with massive amount of auxiliaries sent to also live in this more sanitary conquered lands. Now, the Song dynasty, a bit of background about this, had reigned from 960 until, in fact, these years 1279, experiencing a tumultuous relationship with neighboring powers, particularly during the periods of warfare that defined its existence. Initially, during the Northern Song period, where between 960 and 1127, the dynasty established its capital in Bianjing, managing to reunite much of China after the chaotic 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period that we will see at some point. However, the Song found itself in constant conflict with the Liao dynasty, which was established by the Khitan, as we know, and later the Western Xi and Qin dynasty as well. The struggle against the Liao involved both military confrontation and diplomatic maneuvering, culminating in the Shanyuan Treaty of 1005, which forced the Song to pay tribute to the Khitans, acknowledging their status as an equal power, fundamentally. Despite sporadic military successes, especially against the Western Xia, the Song often were perceived as militarily weak, a view highlighted during the Jin-Song Wars of the early 12th century. Essentially, the Mongolized, more militarized north was sort of beating harder this sort of more civilized but more gentrified southern people. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, a former ally in the fight against the Liao, capitalized on the Song's vulnerabilities, launching a rapid invasion that resulted in the capture of the Song capital. It was in Bianjing. That's why we changed the period here in 1127. This occurred during the Jingkang incident. The aftermath forced the Song court to retreat south to the Yangtze River, marking the transition to the Southern Song period. It would last, as we've seen, until 1279, with Hangzhou, Linan as the new capital. In the Southern Song era, while still recovering from the trauma of invasion and loss, the dynasty adeptly adapted its military strategies, particularly enhancing its naval capabilities to protect maritime trade routes, right, including the ones that would take from the Indian Ocean coming to the north of the Pacific. And so this north that was, as we've seen, actually better sheltered in a let's say coastally speaking, but that also had sort of less resources compared to the south. Right, agriculture was also partly dependent on it. So significant investments for this reason were made in shipbuilding and naval organization, leading to victories against the more backwards Jin navy during notable clashes such as those at Tangdao and Kaishi in the 60s of the 12th century. However, it's of course the rise of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and later Kublai Khan that would pose a new existential threat to the Songs, that initially engaged in an alliance with the Mongols, as we've seen against the Jin, but the alliance soared immediately as the Mongols turned their sights southwards without too much ado after conquering the Jin dynasty. Over the next few decades, the Mongols launched a series of invasions against the Southern Song, employing advanced siege tactics that they had now acquired. The innovative use of gunpowder weapons that we've seen, they had also had to cope with the siege of Kaifeng. Technologies that, however, had seen significant development during the Song era, and so had sort of spread to the north from the south of China. As the Mongols systematically dismantled the Song defenses, the final stand occurred during the Battle of Yamen in 1279. In a moment that underscored the tragic collapse of the dynasty, the young Emperor Zhao Bing committed suicide, marking the end of the Song as Kublai Khan's forces ultimately unified China under the Yuan dynasty. Sticking to the chronology, it's 1260 when Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, through the line of Tuli, proclaims himself Supreme Khan. And initially, things did not really go as hoped because there were many dissenters. However, Kublai managed to impose himself with iron fist and also like more persuasive means. Sometimes several of the outlying provinces, led by lesser princes of the Mongols, still opposed themselves to Kublai's assumption to the throne, vacated by the time of Genghis Khan's death. Right, that's how much they thought of the power of the Mongol people, as we've seen, had been sort of boosted in confidence by the same promises and achievements and promises of Genghis Khan to make, paradoxically, these children of his that had opted, of course, for the more advanced places to rule from, to be recognized as legitimate successors. At least here, the Mongols are still very much connected to their steppes power bases. However, the final conquest of China really opens to a new page in their history, and that's also why essentially the Yuan period begins. At this point, as we were saying before, like the Mongols will remain the Mongols, and China will remain China, with sort of mutual interference, etc. But the Chinese power, of course, is much more lucrative in the first place. Kublai's nephew Kaidu was one of the aforementioned dissenters, and there is an interesting civil war between the Mongols that breaks out with an initial battle in 1268, continuing for, in fact, quite a time. In fact, Kaidu would submit to his uncle Kublai in 1286. The Kaidu-Kublai War would actually go on in part like with other groups of Mongols resisting against the Yuan until 1301. Right, it was really a fierce conflict that pitted, as we've seen, Kaidu, the leader of the House of Ögedei and self-proclaimed Khan of the Chagatai Khanate, against Kublai Khan, who was the founder of the Yuan dynasty, and his successor Temur at that point, because as we've seen, it protracted over the generation. This struggle emerged in the aftermath of the Toluid Civil War and played a significant role in the eventual fracturing of the same Mongol Empire, as we know, into four distinct entities by the time Kublai passed away in 1294. This predates as we were saying before, the end of the Pax Mongolica, because to some extent, of course, like the Mongols still considered themselves for generations, even when having in fact regionalized from different bases of power, as in theory like taking part of the Great Assembly in Mongolia, sharing those, or not even so, because some like this would be abandoned over time, but still finding force in that ancestral divine originary abode, like the source, their legitimization. Think about Timur Lame boasting Chingizid ancestry, like as late in fact as the end of the 14th, the beginning of 15th century, in this essentially like Turkmen Afghan context. The main chunks were, in fact, the Empire of the Great Khan, as it would be known, that the Yuan dynasty of China, that technically was also the one that controlled Mongolia proper, between the Altai and the Khanate mountains. Then you had the Chagatai Khanate in essentially Central Asia, would be again Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. Then you have the Golden Horde, which encompasses the Rus or right stretches up to the Carpathians, depending on the area of influence at different points would do, like the Caucasus, Aral Sea, Kazakhstan. And then you have the Ilkhanate of Persia that at some point extends as far as different times, at least in history, of its influence also in the Anatolian hinterland and beyond, right? And again, we will look at them all in detail at some point, but it's important to realize that the Kaidu Kublai War sort of set a bit the premises for this officialization of descent, or at least lack of recognition internationally from the various chunks. This is probably the moment in which the Mongol Empire fractures, in hindsight, irreversibly. Even though, of course, there were the means to mount up massive expeditions, also transcontinentally, but the question is why, or to which aim? All questions that we will answer in other videos. The war commenced as Kublai sought to assert control over the entirety, in fact, of the vast Mongol territories. That's what the war was, say, ideally fought over, right? Yet Kaidu's early refusal to attend Kublai's court for the recognition of such power, of course, highlighted the growing rift. Maintaining a sense of resistance, Kaidu initiated wars in Central Asia, eventually aligning with Barak, the Chagatai Khan, who also sought to oppose Kublai's authority. Although Kaidu initially found success against Barak and managed to incorporate even several princes into his fold, setbacks such as Barak's defeat in Herat, this tells you, by the way, the scale here, like which still the Mongols moved up to Afghanistan from China, pivoted power dynamics within the Chagatai Khanate. Kaidu's aggressive tactics soon escalated to an invasion of territories loyal to the Yuan dynasty, notably the attempt to subjugate Urumqi in 1275, prompting Kublai Khan to dispatch relief forces. This is interesting. We've seen it also with the West Liao, right? They were literally in Central Asia, but their point was, let's go back to China. That's what we have to fundamentally retake. Consider, because of this, how, again, that thing we were saying about the Mongol conquest of Europe, right? What kind of horizon the Mongols had, after all, in a broader, say, political, international, and cultural way. That does matter a lot. Despite sustained military campaigns, including Kublai's strategic effort to economically isolate Kaidu by stationing garrison in establishing supply lines, this was important because, like, the Silk Road was at stake there. Kaidu's forces continued to raid the region, right? So they're a bit like the rebels of the situation against the bigger empire, rendering, in fact, these maneuvers also largely ineffective. It was incredibly difficult to control Central Asia. All these various peoples that I also mentioned at the beginning had always tried to do it, and it always failed to an extent, because it was impossible essentially to create a strong statehood from there. But the riches, again, at stake were so high that everybody would try to an extent, right? Also basing themselves on more sanitarized realities to do so. But in this sense, maintaining those areas as more peripheral. This is exactly what we were pointing out before. The Chagatai Empire was sort of the most, if not properly, it was not more originally Mongolic, because this was, say, mostly a Turkic populated, also with a lot of Iranian background area, but it was sort of the more wild, out in the sort of semi-nomadic reality, right? A bit like the Golden Horde, but the Golden Horde was also close to sort of more civilized places to an extent. Persia was definitely not like a steppe reality, nor China, evidently. In any case, the political landscape shifted again when Mengu Timur of the Golden Horde passed away. leading to a withdrawal of support for Kaido that had priorly existed from the westernmost Khanate, in a series of peace agreements with Kublai's Yuan dynasty as well. In the years that followed, both Kublai and his successors faced persistent challenges. Kaido remained relentless, launching various incursions into Yuan territory, while simultaneously dealing with internal strife among the Mongol factions. The conflict reached a climax with significant battles where both the Yuan and Kaido's forces endured heavy casualties but failed to secure a decisive victory. Ultimately, Kaido's prolonged campaigns and standoffs with Kublai and Temur proved to be a catalyst for the deepening division of the Mongol Empire. This is sort of obvious. This culminated with Kaido's death in 1301. Though a tentative peace was established in 1304, it merely entrenched the autonomy of the successor states who were exhausted by the war, in the sense we were seeking for territorialization. The general, again, Pax Mongolica and its balance, its wealth had been shattered. There were signs already prefiguring the broader crisis of the mid-14th century would sort of seal these divisions historically, solidifying the fragmentation that had emerged from literally decades of rivalry and warfare, which, especially over these territories, like you can't even ignore. That's why they were both engaged in to this sort of more Central Asian wild background, essentially harassing China and hoping to come back with loot, and from the other side trying to maintain the Silk Route open in control and creating a buffer state to prevent the invasions. But obviously, like, just as you can understand, vectorially and by the means of the time, it doesn't matter how powerful with the Mongols, it wouldn't actually fail. It's just Timur the Lame died before the invasion of China was planned. And this was continuing exactly what had happened in the Chagatai Khaganate at this point. Right? They would have, the point was not to, say, conquer territorially all China, but, say, trying to recover a dynastic place somewhere that was definitely more developed and civilized than Central Asia. The Mongol general Uryang Gatai, son of Subotai, is the protagonist of the Mongolian deep dive into Annam. We've seen this in the video about medieval Vietnamese warfare. The Mongols reached down as far as into the Tonkin Plain and sacked Hanoi in 1257. In 1258, Annam fell completely to the Mongols. Also in this case, it was sort of a northern Vietnamese, like properly Vietnam, like with Annam, and then the Champa was a sort of southern Vietnamese. The latter submitting politically to the Mongols when their leader surrendered. There was a fierceless guerrilla from the Vietnamese side, but sort of this weren't really a match for the Mongols. But very often, like this sort of Mongol invasion is, generally speaking, thought the Mongols had to pull out of there. Yes, it was very hotly fought. Like the people of Vietnam took to the jungles and hills and conducted guerrilla operations against the Mongols for many years. But that is the declaration, of course, of their military inferiority. Right? Guerrilla is a strong form of war, but if you are not able to face your enemy in open ground, yes, you will wearing him out, but let's say if you can't dominate, say, the main centers, you have to escape to the jungle, like you're already showing who is actually in charge. And so the military confrontations between the Mongol Empire and the kingdoms of the Dai Viet and Champa throughout the latter half of the 13th century also represent a significant chapter in Southeast Asian warfare. Initiated by the Mongols in 1258, the series of invasions included additional campaigns in 1282, 1285, and 1287-88, aiming at imposing Yuan authority over these regions. And so there is this controversy, as I was just saying, because historians, we tend to denote the Mongol endeavors as successful. We are looking essentially, however, at the centralized form of government, tributes, right? The modern Vietnamese, also for political sort of propagandistic reason, of course, want to draw the parallel also with the war against the French, the Americans, and others, like sort of celebrating these encounters as pivotal victories against foreign invasion. It's actually a load of BS, right? And again, it's not by guerrilla that you win wars. It's through actually like face-to-face confrontation. And so the idea would never been conquered, right? How many ethno-nationalistically obsessed peoples you know that on YouTube always coming up with the same BS when they were actually ruled by others for centuries. Surely Vietnam was sort of in the far south of the Mongol sort of sphere of influence, at least, yes, to an extent they went even further, but yes, this was a periphery, was fundamentally subjugated to the degree of that the Mongol powers wanted to be satisfactory, right? The fact that sort of the Romans didn't conquer, in the sense they didn't directly rule over Scotland, has it really anything to do with the fact that the Romans really did control Scotland, and they just didn't want to even spend what they didn't need to, just to send some troops there. This is always the same old story. They didn't conquer us, well, but you were basically just revolving around your rulers at that point anyway. Like, it's just a sort of severe mental delusion and disturbance to pretend that, I don't know, if somebody was not just like with one guy at the door, like they actually were, like they were free, they were living in another dimension separated from the rest of it. No, they were essentially dependent, ruled, controlled, manipulated, and subjugated, and paying tributes not to be directly controlled, which is all what the Mongols in this case cared about. The Mongol strategy in Vietnam was shaped by their broader objectives in China, as they sought alternative routes, as we've seen, to attack the Song dynasty, also from the south. So this is what actually initially brought to the first invasion through Dai Viet, which ultimately saw the Mongols capture the Vietnamese capital, Thang Long, that is the present-day Hanoi. So just consider this conquest was just a sort of spin-off of a much broader Mongol successful strategy of conquering the Song that, of course, were a much more important power than Vietnam. There is, however, no doubt that despite their initial success and the formal acknowledgement of tributary relations by Dai Viet, the Mongols suffered considerable losses and were unable to maintain control over the Vietnamese regions at this point. So the subsequent invasions, particularly the two major campaigns in 1285 and 1287-88, revealed the resilience of the Vietnamese forces under leaders like Tran Anh Tong and Prince Tran Hung Dao. The 1285 campaign culminated in a series of engagements where the Mongol forces initially advanced, but ultimately faced overwhelming resistance and logistical challenges, especially that led to their withdrawal. In their third invasion, the Mongol expeditions initially succeeded in occupying Thang Long, but a series of strategic blunders and fierce Vietnamese resistance, especially at critical engagements like the Battle of Bac Dang, resulted in devastating defeats for the Mongols. The Vietnamese operated with innovative tactics, at least relatively, including the use of hidden stakes to ambush the invaders' fleet, right, which underscored their determination to maintain sovereignty. The Mongols mostly cared about the coastal plains, right? They didn't care about the jungle hinterland, so they had acted very amphibiously from the north. As we've seen, the Song had, after they had been conquered, had laid down to the Mongols like their important naval infrastructure that had been providing them with successful means to destroy the the Jin fleets. Beyond military outcomes, the Mongol invasions shaped Vietnamese political dynamics. The Yuan dynasty attempted to exert control over both Dai Viet and Champa, engaging in diplomatic overtures and imposing tribute requirements which were met with resistance. Though the Mongols managed to establish nominal tributary status with both kingdoms, their inability to secure enduring control fostered a sense of national feeling amongst the locals, and so leading partially also to the sense that, again, the myth, right, of this resistance that can never be broken, and this other thing that do not really belong to military history, but only to this obviously, decentralized, autonomous situation that was meant to be so since the beginning. In the wake of these invasions, by the way, both Dai Viet and Champa navigated their relationships with the Yuan dynasty cautiously, accepting tribute requirements while maintaining a degree of autonomy, which was the deal. What is most striking instead is the attempted Mongol invasion of Japan. Right, this took place, as we'll see now, multiple invasions. Sort of the, for example, there are some episodes like the 1274 one witnessed this fleet of 150 vessels landing in the Bay of Akata on Kyushu, and this invasion laid west to Tsushima, by the way, Iki-shima as well. However, it could not reduce the fortress of Mitsuki. And the Japanese finally managed to drive the Mongols out through a counterattack, right? And then you have the 1281 invasion, consisting of the incredible force of, like, we don't know exactly how much. The sources say 45,000 Mongols and 120,000 Chinese and Korean auxiliaries. This is too much, definitely, but this was a massive invasion force. Also this time managing to land, but also this time being kept at bay by the Japanese. And here it's the most famous episode of the kamikaze divine wind steering up a typhoon that emerged as a miraculous supernatural force that totally destroys the invasion craft and destroying the entire invasion arm. And so the numbers are, like, at least in theory, all these 165,000 invaders killed or captured. This, of course, like, there were less, but we don't have reason to think that the Mongols didn't really suffer a staggering amount of casualties, to the point, in fact, that they would never make other attempts to take Japan. And this story is also, this is really, in my opinion, the most fascinating one. We should make something or Schwerpunkt about some battle. We never talk about medieval Japan, really, which is a shame, naturally. But when you look at these invasions of 1274, 1281, you see also, like, a bit the peak of Mongol power, right? These invasions were led by Kublai Khan as part of this broader effort to expand Mongol influence across the entirety of East Asia, following the submission of Korea's Goryeo dynasty as a vassal state. And as long as Japan was there, it had the capacity to foster the exiles opposed to the Yuan dynasty, to back their resistance against the Chinese, especially in this more decentralized regions. So it was very important. It was a sort of 1812 campaign that regard not so vital, actually, as for Napoleon there, like the destruction of Russia was, but definitely one that in the failure which rendered the Yuan universal ambitions incomplete, especially on top of this, shocking, historically speaking, military culture that the Mongols had just brought to the highest level. So here also the Japanese from the other side are very interesting to analyze militarily, but unfortunately today we don't have time for it. We will do, but there will be a chapter dedicated to at least two. They're not going to come in such a long time following the cycle. In any case, these invasions, as we've seen, ended in failure. They ultimately marked critical turning points in Japanese history. In this sense, they really seem more important in influencing national identity and defense strategies for the country than any other in East Asia. The first invasion commenced in 1274. There's an estimate force based on the number of ships before of realistically, right, 15,000 Mongol and Korean troops landing on Tsushima island before advancing towards Akata Bay. In response, Japan mobilized its samurai under the Kamakura shogunate, which had come to power from the Oyo clan. And although the Japanese forces were significantly outnumbered, they managed to repel the invaders assisted by a timely typhoon that devastated the Mongol fleet on its journey, right, reinforcing the Japanese belief in the divine intervention of the kamikaze divine wind. In 1281, the Mongols attempted a second invasion with an even larger force, as we've seen, combining troops from both Korea and southern China. Again, the estimates are staggeringly high, at least some scholars say. This could have not been realistically more than 50,000 men. This time, the invasion was more organized, but faced similarly fierce resistance from the well-prepared Japanese forces who had fortified their defenses since the first invasion. Alright, and as the invaders struck Akata Bay, the Japanese, employing guerrilla tactics and counterattacks, managed to hold their ground despite being outnumbered. Ultimately, another devastating typhoon, as we said, struck the Mongol fleet, and this time the effects were amplified by the scale of the system, right? You know, the bigger the army, the more subject to this natural event. And so leading, once again, but this time to even much more catastrophic losses on the Mongol part, and most of the invading forces being lost at sea or killed upon landing. It was really a slaughter fest. The failed invasions not only halted Mongol expansion into Japan, but also played a crucial role in shaping Japanese martial culture and governmental authority. The methods still is thus civilization. Over the years, the memory of these invasions solidified in a sense of national unity and resilience among the Japanese people against essentially the Chinese, because that's how the invaders were seen. That was also the most close-at-hand civilization that had influenced the same development of Japan, of course, throughout the millennia, in spite of the alleged sort of isolationism of the country. Following the invasions, the shogunate's has already declined, part due to its inability to reward its warriors with land and wealth from Baruch's victorious campaigns anyway, and this led to increased piracy along the coasts of China and Korea, because evidently, like, the Japanese had, it's a bit like, I don't know, the Armada, right? The effect that it had on the same, say, English navy that was growing exactly to meet the let's say the major threat, like, stimulated further these activities, and so with this temporary power vacuum, the Japanese went at sea more. The same people who had fought against the Mongol navy, Mongol Chinese navy at this point. Moreover, the cultural and technological impacts were noteworthy. For example, the Mongol invasions showcased the early use of gunpowder warfare in the same Japan, and Zen Buddhism gained prominence among samurai during this period. Ultimately, these invasions underscored not only the determination of the Japanese people in defending their homeland, but also the limitations of the Mongol Empire naval strategies, thus defining the course of Japanese history for centuries to come. Finally, we talk about Burmese warfare in another video. There is the Mongol invasion of Burma, right, ending up with the Battle of Volchan, that we will see in the next chapter. From 1272 to 1287, you have this precarious independence that the Burmese had maintained, like sort of, sheltered by the mountains, and sort of from the other side of the watershed compared to China, but Indian and Pacific respectively. But in 1287, also Burma was vassalized and incorporated into the Mongol Empire. The same happened to Annam in 1288. And so there is the kingdom of the Khmer, Cambodia, that was particularly more warlike and valorous. There are the famous Angkor Wat reliefs, but this is showing this heavily militarized culture that, however, is submitted to the Mongols by 1294, apparently without the slightest resistance. So the first Mongol invasion of Burma, occurring between 1277 and 1287, represents this struggle between Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty and the Pagan Empire that would culminate with the collapse of the latter. Of course, there was also in this case a Mongol attempt to properly sever the Song Chinese routes, right, from the Pacific to the Indian, by literally encircling the country and asserting dominance over Southeast Asia as a whole. So initially, the Mongols, as habitually, seek tribute from the pagan kingdom, and when the king Narathihabhata refuses to comply with the demands made in the early 70s of the 13th century, war broke out. Again, I discussed this also in a video about Burma. Following a series of incursions and battles, the Mongol forces managed to occupy large swaths of northern Burma, including Tagaung. Despite an eventual ceasefire agreement in 1286 that acknowledged Mongol suzerainty over Burma, the political landscape of the land became unstable with the assassination of Narathihabhata shortly thereafter. The invasions heralded a period of fragmentation, in fact, within Burma, that from there on it sort of would collapse in its unity, leading to the merging of various Tai-Shan states and establishing a Celtic power structure that persisted well into the 14th century. There were incursions from the north historically, either where there's also Sino-Tibetan influences from a long time. So although the Mongols had initially sought to exert control over Burma, their reluctance to restore order after the Pagan Empire's disintegration allowed those local powers to fill the vacuum. As we said before, this territory was not overwhelmingly important, especially since the Songs had been conquered. In the aftermath of, this turmoil witnesses the rise of new regional states, while the traditional centers of power in Burma diminished. The historical phase not only fragmented the political landscape of Burma, but also marked the significant presence of Chinese influence in the region, as the Mongol incursions concluded a legacy of weakened kingdoms and ethnic divisions would characterize the region, with the Tai-Shan states emerging as influential entities over the following centuries. And the following years also witnessed further war and the eventual establishment of the Mencian Kingdom, signaling a shift in power dynamics and laying the groundwork for the continued development of Burmese polities. So when you look at the entire picture on a map, you realize that the Mongols at this point had literally the entire continent of Asia except India under the rule, right? That's also, why they sort of harassed Europe, and they attempt, in fact, to infiltrate in other areas that had not been conquered. There is an inner coherence, however, in the Chinese, basins, let's say, that could simply be dominated from this Mongol power base, right? There is not much to see here, like all this, say, neighboring countries from Japan to the Annam, and this struggle also over the Central Asian trade routes is all part of the same necessity to consolidate as much as possible, like a bulkier as possible dominion that ultimately was at this point based on China, at least territorially speaking. Mongolia would remain again a pool of recruitment for these fierce Mongol warriors that sort of vigorously, resiliently, silently, but also bloodily, literally crossed all this entire enormous territory with incredibly different cultures, languages, levels of development, and fighting also among one another, as we've seen. So it's an incredible history in so many ways, and today we just sort of began to tell it bit by bit, as we always do, and it's really endless, right? We must talk much more about it to an extent that can allow us to, in fact, sort of create a I will create a playlist now, medieval Chinese warfare or something, because it's really it's really something that I want to go a bit more in depth. I think that knowing Chinese warfare, Chinese history, is in many ways like a sort of the most important thing after Europe, at least in this time in history. And then, of course, we will keep observing also this multitude of populations that and polities and dynasties that sort of were in between, and that sort of represent, in fact, also the most typical medievally fragmented reality that, say, here and there, they're sort of more typical to make because there are more, right? So here, talking about China, at least I will make 3 videos and making everything more compact, in fact, and for someone who wants to search for that, not being outnumbered by the others. And there is a hierarchy of importance. I think that, again, it was interesting to... I haven't even created a Chinese warfare, really, no. Playlist. No, there ain't. Well, okay, we will then create one. It's, again, incredibly important. I can't stress how much. It's not going to happen very frequently. In many ways, we also know less, right? Both the older and the newer, say, especially the newer historiography, what survived from those, doesn't tell us too much, right? And also, the one of the time sort of tells it in a different way. I have a playlist dedicated to Chinese warfare, but it's, yeah. Yep. So have only, this is actually Tibetan warfare. I should remove it from here because you're just the, at least territorial, say Chinese territorially based powers, such as the Khitan Liao, for example. So, yep. Let's add to this and let's grow with it. I should make, if anything, a playlist about the enemies of China. Historically, that sort of makes more sense. To sum them up, I had the enemies of Rome, write the enemy and say, well, yeah, something along that pattern. So I can group them, if anything, for having this stuff in common. Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.